You have just joined your first D&D campaign, and you are working on making your first character, and you've reached the stage where you need to write a backstory. If you've reached this part of character creation and you don't really know where to go from here, that is okay. Writing a backstory, especially if you're not really into writing up your own fiction, can be, well, intimidating, and I would go as far as to say very difficult. Writing up a character backstory that fits into the world, that works with the party, that's fun, interesting, but also unique, it can be really hard, especially on your first time. So, here are 6 tips to make it a little bit easier. Make sure to involve your DM when you're writing your backstory. Now, of course, your DM shouldn't be writing your backstory for you. I went over this during our RPG horror story. That's a really, really good way for you to not be invested in the character. You, as the player, should write the backstory yourself. A backstory that you write is always going to be a backstory that you are more connected to. However, the DM can help you. If it's a homebrew world, then the DM will be available to tell you about what countries, cities, cultures they've created. Trust me, as a DM who runs a homebrew campaign myself, I am more than happy to provide tons of lore to my players because I think that's incredibly fun, and I'm sure a lot of DMs out there will agree with me. We love sharing details about our homebrew worlds. If you have just joined a homebrew campaign, take advantage of your DM so that you can learn about the world and integrate your character into the world and into the story. The DM, even if they're running a module, can also help to integrate you into the world. For example, I know almost nothing about Storm King's Thunder. I haven't read through the module at all. If I was to join Storm King's Thunder, then I would ask my DM to give me the basic premises, something to work with so that I can integrate my character into the story. The Dungeon Master may be playing the enemies, but rest assured, they're there to help you through character creation, and that includes backstories. Now, I can't stress this enough. Don't ask your DM to write your backstory for you. You need to do that yourself. But take advantage of your DM to integrate your character into the world. Alright, tip number 2. Make sure to give your character a motive, something that drives them to adventure with the group. This is incredibly important. I often see that when a problem player, joins a campaign and the DM asks them to do something, they respond with, "Oh, my character wouldn't do that," or "My character wouldn't join into this situation." My immediate question when I read RPG horror stories like that is, what's the point of this person being here, and why did you make this character if they're not going to interact with the campaign at all? This is really, really bad. Your character needs to have a motivation to be there, and it's really simple to write one in. Anything from just, my character was adventuring along when they were attacked by the dragon cult, incentivizing your character to fight with the party against that dragon cult. Or, my character is looking for ancient artifacts and there's one located near where the cult is based, incentivizing your character to go to where the cult is based and join the party in fighting them, etc, etc, etc. There are really easy ways just to work your character in. It doesn't need to be big. Like I said in a previous video, you don't need to be super hooked into the story, but just small little events like that can go a long way to integrate your character into the story and into the party, and giving them a motive to be there. If you need to wonder every time your party does anything if your character would actually interact with the group or if your character would stick around, then your character isn't really properly motivated. They need to have a motivation to be there. You shouldn't be concerned about what your character would do when playing a D&D game. That should be something to build your character, not restrict them and cause them not to interact with the group or with the story. So make sure your character has a motivation to be in the group and be in the story in the first place. Tip number 3. Coordinate with your group, either directly or through the DM. This one is also incredibly important. Your group is going to be disjointed and dysfunctional, but you don't want a group of characters that hate each other. I gave an example in the previous video about how when I didn't have a session 0, I inadvertently caused 2 characters in my campaign to be hostile to each other story-wise. One of them was a necromancer, the other one was an Oath of Vengeance paladin that hated undead. Their involvement with each other didn't really make much sense, and neither player was experienced enough in roleplay to sort it out in a story sense. So we just really had this awkward party dynamic that didn't really make any sort of sense. In that specific example, that was on me. However, a lot of the time you need, as the player, to coordinate with the group yourself and to sort out how your character will fit into the dynamic. Now, again, like I said, you don't need to have a streamlined adventuring group first go. In fact, most of the time, dysfunctional groups are the most fun. But like I said, you don't want a group of characters that are supposed to hate each other story-wise. And if you do have a group of characters that would be hostile to each other in a story sense, then you need to be experienced enough in roleplay to sort that sort of thing out. Again, Oath of Vengeance Paladin working with a Necromancer can actually be really interesting, but the players need to be experienced enough to sort out that sort of situation. Coordinating with your group isn't just to prevent hostile party dynamics. It can also be used to build cool relationships that existed before the party between characters. For example, if you look at Critical Role, I'm not going to mention Ford. We're going to talk about Not and Caleb, two characters who had an association before the game even started in a story sense, which is really, really cool. Their relationship in the show is one of the favorites of the community, and for a good reason. The two players are really good at it, but their relationship also wouldn't be the same without the history between them. I think that's a big part of what makes them so special. If you are comfortable with doing so, having those sort of pre-existing relationships with other members of the party can really help people to come out of their shell as well. If you're afraid of roleplay and you want a character backstory that can allow you to jump into the conversation during the game, then this is a great way to do it. Having a pre-existing relationship with another character, preferably played by a person that you get along with, can allow you to join into the game. That's a great example of how the choices made during your backstory can really help you in a roleplay sense during the game. Overall, communicating and coordinating with the other members of your group, either through a group chat, through a meeting, or just indirectly through the DM, is a really great way to, 1, prevent any sort of hostile dynamic between members of your party, but also to build interesting relationships that took place before the story, and make sure your party has a well-rounded dynamic before the first dice even hits the table. Tip number 4. Always make sure to give your characters interesting flaws and quirks. So let's start out with flaws. Last episode, I talked about how important it is to give characters flaws, as flaws make powers interesting. We always remember what our characters are good at. However, what our characters are bad at, that's just as important. Think about live streamed games, or even just movies you watch. Some of my favorite moments from shows like Critical Role don't come from the things the characters are good at, they come from what the characters are bad at. For example, when two characters who are kind of socially interesting, let's just say a low intelligence barbarian and a high charisma gnome, went out to go look for this lord, antics ensued because of the barbarian's low intelligence and some things that he had done beforehand, involving getting violent with the guards. Those were situations that arose from the barbarian's flaw. He's kind of dumb and a little bit reckless. However, it's one of the most hilarious and best moments of the show. You can pull this from anything, just beyond D&D. Flaws are always good for your character. However, I often see that new players forget to include flaws because we focus way more on what characters are good at, which isn't a bad thing. Your character should be good at stuff. I mean, you don't want to make just a character who's terrible at everything, but including a flaw can really round out a character and make them way more interesting, and can lead to some amazing moments in your game. Now, what about quirks? Why did I include quirks? Now, quirks and flaws are not necessarily the same thing. What I mean by quirks are interesting things to really flesh out your character and make them feel like a person. For example, take Beth Harmon from Queen's Gambit. She has a habit of dressing up really, really fancy. She loves high fashion, and it's never really explained why. Sure, it could be an aspect of her backstory, or it could be some kind of symbolism, but it doesn't have to be. It's just an interesting habit that she has. People have interesting habits that make them more memorable. Let's go back to Critical Role. The character Percy always introduces himself with his super long name. That's a quirk that really makes him memorable. It's not the only thing that makes him memorable, but it's an interesting aspect of his character that accentuates his personality and makes him more rounded out. Quirks, flaws. They're really important and often forgotten about, so don't forget about them. Tip number 5. Don't make the backstory too long. Now, we all love being detailed, but you don't need to be detailed in a 10-page backstory or even a 5-page backstory. Keep it to 2 pages, MLA format, double space, all that. 2 pages is really all you need to convey out the basic details of your character, personality, and basic backstory. Now, you might be thinking, well, my backstory is super long and loaded with a lot of content. I need more than 2 pages. Well, that brings me to my second point. If your backstory is too loaded, then why are you playing this character? Here's what I mean. If your character has already found a forgotten sword, slewn a king, killed gods, fought in massive wars, then where does your character have to go from there? Your backstory should be a basic origin story. I don't even mean Iron Man by the end of Iron Man 1. I mean Iron Man by the time he gets out of the cave and builds his first suit. That's what I mean. That's a perfect backstory. If you're not familiar with the movie, what happens is this rich billionaire, Tony Stark, gets kidnapped by some terrorists and he has to escape with his first Iron Man suit. When he escapes, he makes a promise to his friend he made in captivity, as well as a new goal in life. And, arguably most importantly for a D&D character, he has a new tool to get that goal done, the Iron Man suit. That's it. That is the perfect backstory. Now you're probably thinking, what about the rest of the movie? Well, the rest of the movie is the continuation of that story. Why should you not include it in the backstory? Because the continuation of your character's story should be played out in the game. Remember, you're not just writing a novel. You're writing this character for a D&D game. If your character's story is already done by the time the first dice hits the table, what's the point of having them there? Their story should not be complete in any way. You should have obvious places to take the character during gameplay. Tip number 6. This is a really important one to me. Look, don't be afraid of cliches. Now, I'm not saying you should directly rip off a property such as Game of Thrones or Star Wars or Buffy the Vampire Slayer or whatever. You shouldn't just take characters from that and put them as your characters in a D&D game. I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you do that. Writing an interesting player character is a lot of fun, so just ripping off a character from a property, well, you're doing yourself a disservice. But don't be afraid to make an elven druid. Don't be afraid to make a human fighter. Don't be afraid to make a half-orc barbarian. Don't be afraid of any of those things. Don't be afraid to take inspiration from your favorite properties. I often find that cliches are looked down upon. Now, I love playing unorthodox characters. That's some of my favorite stuff. It's great. I love unorthodox characters. I really love it when they work in the game, but I'm also not going to frown upon just making an elven druid. Sure, is it stereotypical? Yeah, I guess so, but who cares? You're playing a game with your friends. If you want to make an elven druid with flowers growing out of her hair who turns into a wolf and rips apart her enemies, that is awesome. Go for it, alright? Don't be afraid of cliches. Don't be afraid to take inspiration. Now, of course, I'm not saying to rip off something. Again, I think that's lame and disservice. But, look, almost every story has been told at some point. Everything takes inspiration from something else. It's just inevitable at this point. So don't be afraid if you have a character whose father was executed by the king. That doesn't mean you're ripping off Arya Stark. It just means that you're taking inspiration from a story you like, and that's good, okay? So, don't be afraid of cliches. Don't be afraid to take inspiration. And I think that is all of them. If you guys enjoyed this episode of Tabletop Tavern Tips, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more episodes of Tabletop Tavern Tips as well as my other series, RPG Horror Stories, then please do hit that subscribe button. And if you want to leave your own tips, thoughts, stories, etc., then go down to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.